Hello, my name is Lauren Jean. The topic of my microteaching assignment is the theory of psychosocial development by Erik Erikson. You may notice that it may get a little dark because I have to switch the lighting in order for you to see my projector, but I'll try my best to make sure that you can see me and the PowerPoint at all times. What will we be considering today? We're going to consider who is Erik Erikson, what is the theory of psychosocial development, and more importantly, how does this relate to our system of education and how we service and deal with our students on a day-to-day basis? So who is this mystery man behind the theory? Well, his name was Erik Erikson, as pictured here. Erik Erikson was German-born. He moved to the United States where he later built on his theory of psychosocial development and also became a professor at institutions such as Harvard. Erik Erikson was one of the most notable ego psychoanalysts. He focused on ego identity and was able to allow others to see how the experiences that they went through or that they were able to develop really shaped their personality and their ego as a whole. And so he was definitely influenced by Sigmund Freud, which is why I have this picture here. Sigmund Freud focused a lot on personality, whereas Erik focused on ego. And so you're going to be able to see today how ego and culture are tied together and how culture and society have a really big part on the development of our ego within society. So he basically expanded on Sigmund Freud's theory. We're also going to identify the term identity crisis and really understand where that term came from and what it means within the theory of Erik Erikson's psychosocial development. Well, if you can see, the theory is based on 8 stages of psychosocial development. And so the idea behind this theory is that there are 8 identifiable stages of development in which there can be positive or negative experiences or psychosocial crises that help to shape or develop our personalities and our egos. According to Erikson, the ego develops as it successfully resolves crises that are distinctly social in nature. And so this means that we need to be able to establish a sense of trust in others, which is one of the first virtues that we see pop up. We need to develop a sense of identity in society, which can definitely be built on within these few segments. And then we need to also be able to help the next generation prepare for the future, which you'll see pop up later on in the middle-aged adult and older adult age brackets. So let's build on the first virtue, which is trust versus mistrust. Infants look to their primary caregivers for stability and for consistency of care. And so if this care is consistent and reliable, it will allow that child to develop a sense of trust that will carry into other relationships in the future. This leads to a virtue of hope if a crisis ever arises. If crisis ever arises again, that child is able to identify that they are secure and supported and will be cared for by someone. If there's a failure to develop this trust, it will result in a lack of trust. And most of the time, this does develop into fear or lack of trust within others. This virtue is definitely going to be developed from the beginning years, so 0 to 18 months, from newborn on to the next developmental phase is autonomy versus shame and doubt. This is definitely developed between 18 months and 3 years, so these are the toddler years. And so in the toddler years, there needs to be a delicate balance from parents in the physical development of their child. That child may want to become more assertive and may want to do other things such as tying their shoes or maybe feeding themselves. And one thing that was really important that Erikson definitely stressed was that they must not be criticized for failures or accidents. You don't want there to be any loss of self-esteem within this developmental phase. And so there are 2 outcomes. If they're encouraged and supported, they're going to be confident and secure in their abilities. This is going to lead to a virtue of will. Whereas if they are criticized and overly controlled, this may lead to a lack of self-esteem, and they may feel a sense of shame and doubt in their abilities between 3 to 5 years, which are the preschooler years. And this is the initiative versus guilt phase. In this phase, children begin to assert themselves more. They take more independence in what they are doing. And the most important event at this stage is independence. A child will continue to be assertive and take initiative, and they're eager for responsibility. So 2 outcomes, of course, will come from this. If allowed to take initiative, they feel secure in their ability to lead others and make decisions. And this leads to a virtue of purpose. Right now, as a child, this leads to a purpose within the family, but later on, this will lead to purpose within the society. If they're not allowed to develop this virtue, they sometimes have a sense of guilt, and they may feel like a nuisance and to others, and lack that self-initiative that they would have developed. Takes place between 5 years and 13 years of age. This is the grade school years. This is coined as the industry versus inferiority, or competence versus inferiority phase. And so teachers begin to take a very important role in this child's life, and so do peer groups. They start to build on and have greater significance on the self-esteem of that child. The child is also learning between perseverance and pleasure of saying job completed. And so 2 outcomes come from this. If children are encouraged and reinforced for their initiative, they feel confident in their ability to achieve these goals, and this leads to competence. Whereas if they're not encouraged, then that child may begin to feel inferior, doubt their own abilities, and they may not reach their full potential because of lack of development. In the identity versus role confusion phase, which is usually 13 to 20 years age, this is the teenage years, adolescents search for a sense of self and personal identity. One of the most important events within this developmental phase are the peer relationships, and that's because they start to have an intense exploration of personal values, beliefs, goals, and sometimes those peers can influence these different personal identity pieces. 2 outcomes. Erickson claims that if the adolescent feels uncomfortable about their body before they can adapt and grow into these changes, this leads to a virtue of fidelity. However, failure to establish a sense of identity within society can lead to role confusion. So this role confusion involves an individual not being sure about themselves or their place within society, and this can lead to identity crisis. So this is where the term identity crisis appears. We know that most of the time you hear people say, oh, he's having an identity crisis, this person thinks that they're one thing when they aren't, and so this can definitely be developed in the early teenage years or up to 21 years of age, when a person doesn't really know where they fit or how their values may fit in with society. And one thing that needs to be brought out is that having a positive outcome will lead to a virtue of fidelity. And so that means that they need to be able to feel comfortable with who they are, and know that they'll grow into a better person or grow into whatever they see fit. From ages 21 to 39, these are the young adult years. There's intimacy versus isolation. So within this phase, we see that individuals begin to share themselves more intimately with others. They get to explore relationships and which leads sometimes to commitment. So there are 2 outcomes. If they're successfully able to complete this phase or this state, they may result in happy relationships. This leads to a virtue of love. They're more able to commit and be able to have a part within these relationships. Whereas if they have failure to become involved in commitments, relationships, and stay isolated, sometimes that can lead to depression. So we definitely see this happen within those middle age years, the mid-20s, where if they're unable to commit because of this developmental phase, then they're able to sometimes start to develop depression versus stagnation phase. This is from 40 to 65 years of age, and these are the middle-aged adults. And so at this point, we have established careers, people begin to settle down, start families, and they really start to see the bigger picture and their place within society. So there's 2 outcomes. You can become a productive member of society. This leads to a virtue of fidelity. Or failure to achieve these objectives lead to a feeling of unproductivity. Again, unsure on how you fit into society because you are stagnant. You have no growth. That Erickson identifies is the integrity versus despair phase, and this is from 65 years onward. Within this phase, you start to slow down in productivity as you're an older person now. You explore life, but you really contemplate the decisions and the experiences that you've had, the accomplishments and successes that you've had, and develop integrity in them. And so there are 2 outcomes. You can either feel accomplished and productive in what you've done, and that usually leads to a virtue of wisdom, or failure to achieve these objectives may lead to a feeling of hopelessness and depression, and really like, what have I done over the past few years? And so that integrity won't be developed. We just discussed a lot of different developmental phases. Our students have gone through a few of them. They for sure will go through a few others. And then there's one phase that our students are in right now, especially my students as I teach high school. And so why is all of this information important? Well, as teachers, we want to have a better understanding as to the experiences that may have led to the development of individuals such as our students. More importantly, it helps us to understand student behavior. If we're able to understand maybe these different phases or stages of development, we're able to see maybe at what point our students have, maybe dropped off or had failure developing, and maybe we're able to help them secure these different developmental stages, or at least work on them. It allows us to have a better sense of how we can approach each of these children differently, and even use them when we talk about differentiation. The most important phases that I think can actually be used for any teacher, because we see students usually from ages 5 all the way up to 21. The first is industry or competence versus inferiority. And as discussed before, this is when we start to see that teachers begin to take an important role in a child's life. And so definitely this is one of the phases where we want to build within this phase. We want to make sure that we make the positive relationships that we need to with our children and really help build their self-esteem. As teachers don't realize this, but they really play a huge part in the self-esteem of children within this phase. Another is the identity versus role confusion. This is from ages 13 to 21. Most importantly, these are my students, and so I definitely took this phase or this developmental stage to heart. As stated before, this is where they start to have an idea of self. They start to identify themselves and explore their values and their beliefs, and how do they fit within society, and how do their goals fit in with society. And this was most important to me because I was able to see how I would help a student identify who they are and really get to know self in order to make these goals and really find their presentation. The 2 questions that I have are located in the forum. Thank you for watching my Microteach. I know there was a lot of information that I had to provide. I do hope that other than this being one of my assignments, that you guys were able to learn about the developmental stages, the psychosocial developmental stages, and really find a way to implement them within your classroom. If you have any questions, feel free to respond on the forum or ask them indirectly through a note.